Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Peter Knox. I'm the director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities here at Case Western Reserve University. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second of the Walter A. Strauss lectures this year by Philip Kitcher from Columbia University on Shaping the Citizen. To introduce our speaker tonight, I want to introduce my colleague from the Department of Philosophy, Chris Hoffa, who will have more to say.
Good evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Philip Kitcher from Columbia. Philip was trained as a philosopher of science and mathematics at Princeton in the 70s. His early work focused on the nature of mathematical and scientific knowledge, the latter looking at what was then largely neglected biological sciences. And this foundational work served as the platform for scathing and influential criticisms of creation science and sociobiology. In the early 1990s, he began what is now a widespread effort to combine traditional philosophical approaches to scientific knowledge with insights into the social dimensions of organized formal inquiry. A decade later, he initiated another, now very active line of research, reflecting on how the interests and concerns of the general public should be incorporated into the decisions about the direction of scientific research in a democracy. And since 2005, his work has paid increasing attention to philosophical aspects of music and literature. And I think that it's pretty fair to say that no other philosopher really in the last half century has written with as much sophistication, technical competence, and authority on as wide a variety of questions as Philip Kitcher. And in the last 10 years alone, he's published 9 books and nearly 60 articles, which for philosophy is a pretty intense clip. Just a brief sampling of his numerous awards and accolades. He was the recipient of the Imre Lakatos Award, which is for the best book in philosophy of science, in 1986. He was a Guggenheim Fellow in 1988. He's been the past president of the American Philosophical Association. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science. He's been Phi Beta Kappa professor twice in the last 15 years. He was the first recipient of the American Philosophical Association Prometheus Prize for expanding the frontiers of science and philosophy. He received the Friend of Darwin Award in 2008, Humboldt Prize in 2010. In 2013, elected both a laureate of the International Academy of Humanists and an honorary foreign member of the Turkish Academy of Sciences. And just in 2015, he was awarded the Berlin Prize by the American Academy of Berlin. As a person, Philip's widely known across academia for his generous spirit and his gentle, patient manner. He's directed over 24 dissertations in philosophy and served on I don't know how many other committees, including those of several of the most prominent philosophers of science working today. And just, Philip was my advisor, so it's, I've been kind of fantasizing about, introducing him for 15 years. And, I think, I just wanted to say, so on a personal level, there's really 3 people in this world that deserves her credit for raising me: my mother, father, and Philip Kitcher. As an incoming graduate student, I know that I did not inspire a lot of confidence in the Columbia philosophy faculty. And Philip was extremely patient with me and just kind of let me bounce around the landscape of contemporary philosophy, and really gave me time to mature to the level where I was able to gain the confidence of at least him. I think the others are still holdouts. Philip, he's really the kind of person that will do absolutely anything for his students. He's never refused, one of my many, many requests, no matter how little time I've left for him to fulfill it. And I know that's not rare, that people, many of whom aren't even his students, have received this same treatment. So it's just not unusual for him to do that. So I won't bore you any further with my personal reminiscences. Let's hear Philip on Shaping the Citizen.
Well, that was very kind, Chris. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a fantasy from the future. By midsummer 2101, as yet more record temperatures were reported from an ever wider collection of places, the Intergovernmental Office of Environmental Studies finally announced the answer to a long-debated question. Many figures for the rise in the mean temperature of the Earth during the 21st century had been proposed. But it turned out that the right value was 4.74 degrees Celsius, rather more than optimists had expected and somewhat less than pessimists had feared. This, by the way, is from an MIT website where you can go and play roulette with the planetary temperature. It's kind of fun. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that the expected value for the temperature in 2101 would be in the 5 to 6 degree range. So, as I said, rather more than optimists had expected and somewhat less than pessimists had feared. The report was discussed by the former residents of the Bay of Bengal in the various places to which they had fled, by the refugees from the Great American Desert, and the billions displaced from sub-Saharan Africa. A few lucky gamblers raised their glasses of Hebridean Chardonnay. It was an occasion for reflection on the huge death toll of the past half century, and also for an unusually popular podcast, a quaintly anachronistic form of communication that survived only in backwater academic circles. Nobody would have expected an obscure professor of classical philosophy, one of the few remaining members of that apparently useless breed, to engage so large an audience, but the piece struck a chord. The professor pointed out convincingly that an ancient thinker had predicted that allowing popular government would end in catastrophe. Even the opening of the podcast was quaint. It began with the now defunct subjunctive. Were Plato living today, he would be hard-pressed to avoid saying, "I told you so." Although he would have seen our political systems as peculiar types of oligarchy, one of his central messages was that government is too difficult to be left to the ignorant. If those who don't know important things are allowed to have a say, any say in the crafting of policies, there's a serious danger that foolish things will be done or that necessary things will be left undone. So-called democratic societies are disasters waiting to happen, and in the early 21st century, the trouble finally erupted on a grand scale. Expert advice, even when loudly and forcefully given, was ignored. Urgently needed sacrifices were rejected. Devotion to a misguided political system led to the irreversible modification of the one planet we have and to the deaths of well over 1 billion people, not to mention the reduction of billions more to lives of hardship and squalor. That opening paragraph, for all its archaic usages, resounded in the consciousness of a broad public. At last it was clear what had gone wrong. Our species had paid the price for its addiction to a political fetish, its obsession with democracy. Back to the present. Plato misdiagnosed the problem. He supposed that most people are natively too stupid to be allowed a voice in social decision-making. But my dystopian fantasy and the kindred troubles apparent in contemporary political life don't result from any widespread lack of intelligence. They are the products of ignorance, and that ignorance has been carefully cultivated. Eloquent thinkers have supported the ability of the masses to understand political issues, provided they're given the opportunity. John Milton, Thomas Jefferson and John Stuart Mill delivered classic defenses of the importance of free and open debate. If people are to support policies that will promote their goals, they need to understand the effects of the measures under discussion. The required understanding can be generated if there is a public arena in which the issues are debated. Milton's Areopagitica explained how this works. It's a wonderful quote, so I'm going to read it to you. And though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. Milton saw, at least dimly, what Jefferson and Mill would later miss. Under some circumstances, public debate might fail to work its supposed good, for truth might not be in the field, might not be even of the slightest interest to those who speak. Classic bullshitters in Harry Frankfurt's sense, people whose interest in the truth is non-existent. And the encounter might not be free and open. Perhaps, unlike some contemporary enthusiasts for open debate, Milton appreciated the disruptive possibilities of alternative facts and well-heeled merchants of doubt. Perhaps he foresaw Breitbart and Fox News and the Koch brothers. Plato understood democracy's appeal. Its champions, he told us, will point to the freedoms democracy provides. The crux of his argument for the rule of the wise exposes the freedoms as illusory. The masses troop to the polls, hoping to advance particular goals. Because they don't know how the proposed policies would affect their ends, they support candidates and measures subverting what they most dearly want to achieve. Whether their self-undermining stems from stupidity or ignorance, including carefully manufactured ignorance, is in the end immaterial. In a shallow sense, democracy exists wherever there are elections, protections against coercion of voters, typically several choices of candidates, and public debate of the issues. Shallow democracy has been applauded in images of new voters waving ink-stained fingers in the air. It can be found around the globe, although not in all the nations that advertise themselves as democracies. Happily, shallow democracy still exists in the United States. Deeper democracy, million democracy as I'll call it, doesn't. If democracy is required to guard against the irony of self-undermining, acting contrary to your interests at the moment when you are supposed to be exercising your freedom, then democracy has lapsed in America. Future climate catastrophes can't be traced to infatuation with million democracy. A better verdict from the future would recognize how million democracy died and only a shell remained. Just over a century ago, in the greatest contribution to the philosophy of education since Plato's Republic, John Dewey yoked the concepts of democracy and education, and I've followed him in linking them. One reason for doing so should now be apparent. Million democracy can only be preserved so long as the adult citizens have capacities for working through debates about how various policies bear on their interests. In an increasingly complex world where issues turn on technical details, equipping people for the necessary investigations and reflections needs to be undertaken by the educational system, and that task is far from easy. Milton, Jefferson, and Mill can be forgiven for their optimism about public debate. The questions salient for them, whether to allow divorce or religious diversity, say, could be grasped without any specialized knowledge. That isn't the way we live now. For most of the history of our species, individual human beings have been able to transcend the body of information they could obtain by themselves through relying on others. Most societies have enjoyed a clear division of epistemic labor, marking out who is to be believed on what topic. The developmental psychologist Paul Harris has offered an illuminating account of how young children learn whom to trust. Their local strategies and they're the strategies we all continue to use, break down when public dissemination of information becomes driven by considerations of profit, when market forces favor finding a niche and feeding the chosen audience news it wants to hear, and when checks on veracity are themselves disputed. The rise of the internet has only contributed further confusion. Social markers of expertise dissolve, and with their demise vanishes the hope of functional division of epistemic labor. Citizens are encouraged to choose experts, or so-called experts, suited to their political inclinations, or to conclude that there aren't any experts. As the rampant Brexiteer Michael Gove reminded British voters, people in this country have had enough of experts. Education ought to prepare citizens for knowing enough to express their interests in the preferences they exhibit in the polling booth. How can that best be done? Progress in restoring million democracy would seem to require attention to 4 capacities, 3 of them cognitive and 1 affective. First, and perhaps most obviously, is skill in critical thinking, conceived not simply as having a nose for fallacious reasoning, but also as a disposition to find perspectives to expose what is being omitted in a persuasive presentation. Second is a clear understanding of the principal institutions of the society, of the limits prescribed for the occupants of various offices, and of the ways in which benefits flow to people in particular positions. The third cognitive ability, already emphasized in current educational theorizing, consists in some degree of understanding in various technical fields. Training in the natural sciences, people often say, is important for everyone, since so many policy questions turn on scientific facts. You could see this already in Mill's address that I quoted last time. He wants everyone to know some physiology because the sanitary matters are important to all of us. Now, I'm going to say more in my last lecture about education in the sciences, but one preliminary point is pertinent here. The pace of research in the natural sciences, combined with the unpredictable entanglements of science and policy issues over the course of a lifetime, make it hard, if not impossible, to prepare citizens adequately through extensive training in the so-called relevant scientific fields. The educators of the 1950s could not have foreseen the future importance of the then nascent molecular biology. Their counterparts in the 1970s had no advance warning of the relevance of climate science. To rely on this third capacity, technical knowledge of science, alone, is a recipe for helping people think through yesterday's list of disputed questions. Perhaps this is one source of Dan Kahan's surprising finding that perspectives on the reality of anthropogenic global warming are relatively unaffected by levels of scientific knowledge. As you'll see from these graphs, as you increase what Kahan calls climate science literacy, that you actually get a divergence between what conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats believe. Apparently, the more you know about science, the more you go with your political inclinations. However much time and effort are invested in science education as typically conceived in schools and universities, it's highly unlikely that it could prepare any large fraction of the American electorate to work through the technicalities of the political questions they'll encounter. Even if the curriculum were to succeed providentially in covering just those areas of science involved in the decisions of the coming decades, anything short of specialist training would leave the future citizen vulnerable to bafflement in the face of competing experts. For as the controversies over climate science have shown, the graphs and charts standardly deployed to present the data can be challenged. The internet provides alternative versions of the temperature record of our planet. Those at odds with the view from climate science are routinely defended by alleging that the orthodox view rests on errors and tricks. Very few people, Even people with advanced degrees in other sciences are in any position to work through the ways in which a complex mass of data has been collected and analyzed to present a picture of a trend, and to understand exactly why the consensus perspective from climate science is justified. Even in the end, even the scientifically well-educated must decide which of the clashing voices to trust. To be armed against deception and confusion, citizens need capacities for analyzing and working through complex debates. Part of that requires learning how to identify ways in which conclusions are properly supported by evidence, the province of logic as understood in Mill's inaugural address. Instruction in this area should include parts of mathematics typically downplayed in the high school curriculum. Some acquaintance with probability, statistics, and decision theory looks far more valuable for participation in civic life than most of the algebra, trigonometry, geometry, and calculus through which American adolescents are asked to slog. Yet the development of formal skills is only part of the package. Young people can gain much by studying how past controversies were resolved within science, in social applications of the sciences, and in the mess of political life. Judgment can be developed by providing a menu of examples with which the debates of the future can be compared. But focusing on analytic skills is not enough. At the end of the day, the citizens have to trust some group of self-described experts when they report on the evidence. Deciding who is reliable is often more complicated than inspecting a track record of uncontroversial successes and/or failures. Future citizens require an understanding of how the institutions of their societies work, how particular individuals are recruited to particular positions, how their pronouncements are likely to be affected by social or political linkages, and how various segments of the populations benefit or lose from the widespread acceptance of particular views. Achieving a reasonable division of epistemic labor requires augmenting our childhood strategies for learning who to trust with a rich social understanding. Citizens must come to recognize ways in which expert opinion can be simulated or distorted. Unfortunately, perfecting the inculcation of these cognitive virtues would still fall short. Unless the future voters are prepared to listen to a wide range of viewpoints, even perspectives they find uncongenial, they're likely to remain trapped in the politically colored vision they have initially acquired. Before you can assess a debate, you must first listen. Listen seriously to the case for the opposition. Without an effective capacity, a willingness to take seriously the ideas and arguments of fellow citizens, no amount of talent for analysis and judgment will solve the problem. Dewey's link between democracy and education is misunderstood if he's read as prescribing a mixture of logic and civics as a cure for ignorance. The million democracy lacking in American society, a condition in which citizens have a good chance of making electoral choices suited to their interests and thus expressive of their freedom. That form of democracy is not deep enough. Deep democracy, Deweyan democracy, is not directly about voting at all. Political democracy, he tells us, is not the whole of democracy. Democracy is rather, he says, a personal way of individual life. A democracy is more than a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. For Dewey, deep democracy is education. Now, this is an apparently very peculiar view, and I want to defend it by offering 3 lines of argument. I'm going to start with a worry raised in considering education for million democracy. Shallow democracy conceives democratic societies as defined by opportunities to cast votes. You can get to vote, you're in a democracy. Million democracy adds a condition. The electorate must be informed enough so that the preferences expressed at the ballot box express the voter's interest and thus advance the voter's freedom. Preparing young people to be able to recognize their interests, even in a confusing world, requires inculcating various cognitive skills together with a disposition to engage seriously with the alternative perspectives expressed in socio-political debate. Without some tendency to view the proponents of those perspectives as fellow citizens, people whose aspirations and whose ideas should be seriously considered, deployment of the purely cognitive capacities is unlikely. And perhaps this is part of the phenomenon behind Kahan's depressing results. Attaining million democracy requires educating a citizenry prepared to open themselves to ideas they initially find wrong-headed and even dangerous. Voters become aware of their interests by working through debates, and the work begins from viewing fellow citizens as people from whom one might learn. The second of my 3 lines of thought might be called, with apologies to Tocqueville, the tyranny of voting. Suppose the line of reasoning I've just offered you is flawed. Million democracy can be attained and voters can identify their interests without any attitude of openness to others. The interests in question are understood as the goals most central to their lives, the aims they would reflectively endorse. Such aims are bound by the law. Beyond that, they are unconstrained. If the result I hope to achieve would make you unhappy, even if it would interfere with your pursuit of what matters most to you, there is no requirement for me to revise my intentions, so long as there are no relevant legal protections to which you might appeal. My judgments about my interests don't have to take you into account. If we're both fortunate enough to have candidates who represent our interests, those candidates will compete for votes. Maybe yours will win, maybe mine will win. Perhaps we'll both be disappointed. After the victorious candidate has been declared, there's no reason for the winner's supporters to regret the predicaments of those who've lost, or even to think further about them. The electorate has decided, and that's that. So imagine a society in which indifference to others, both in forming preferences and in reflecting on electoral results, prevails. That may not be so difficult to imagine. Million democracy is in place. That is difficult to imagine. And all the voters understand where their own interests lie. Moreover, interests repeatedly conflict, and the conflicts affect people's chances of attaining their central goals. Maybe the political clashes always end in victory for one particular group and defeat for another. Some are always in the majority, others are permanent losers. Or possibly the fortunes of the groups wax and wane. Most people experience periods for which they are ascendant, and others when their aspirations are frustrated. Or maybe the shifts in electoral success are so frequent that everyone experiences times of critical reversal. Today, my triumph permanently scuttles your plans, and tomorrow I'm paid back in kind. Now, the first scenario, the permanent majority and the permanent minority, is the tyranny of the majority feared by Tocqueville and Mill. The second two are potentially worse, leading to outcomes in which no member of the society successfully pursues his own good in his own way, Mill's fundamental freedom. My third line of thought builds on these reflections. So far, my discussion of democracy has been oversimplified. I've talked as if democracy were a concept applicable only or primarily to whole societies or to nation states. But democracy can exist at any number of distinct scales. Like charity, it can begin at home. Although patriarchy has been a dominant mode in the history of the family, more democratic forms of decision-making have been practiced, especially recently. Today, nuclear families often settle important matters through exchanges in which the adult members participate on equal terms. And as the children grow, they're frequently included as well. Extended family councils probably have a longer history. For family democracy, voting is a practice of last resort. When people remind their adolescent children, as I sometimes did, that mother has 51% of the votes, the remark is intended as a joke. Democratic families value exchange, discussion, conversation. Their members are interested in understanding what others want and why they want it. They're prepared to adjust their own attitudes in light of what others say. The amusing but touching limit of the willingness to listen comes when, once the difference of opinion about what to do is clear, everyone flips, reversing judgment to defer to the views previously expressed by others, so that divergence remains. Chris talked about my graduate mentoring, and I once had a wonderful graduate student who may be the most altruistic person I have ever met in my entire life, who told me about how her family deliberates, and they do just that. As soon as preference is expressed, everybody changes to adopt somebody else's. No democratic family would be happy to resolve its disagreements by having all the members announce what they prefer and then tallying the votes. Family democracy is an exercise in Deweyan mutual learning. Yet even at a larger scale, similar attitudes sometimes prevail. Within small communities where people live side by side, working together and sharing times of good fortune and of bad, great effort is sometimes made to explore and understand the members' different perspectives and their reasons for holding them. Pursuing a policy that would lead any individual dissatisfied is seen as failure. The councils of the Inuit and the New England town meetings of the early 19th century exemplify a commitment to mutual engagement, conceived as directed towards a solution with which all those in the community can live. Those town meetings famously inspired Tocqueville, who took them to be part of the essence of American democracy. Now, group decisions might be viewed as lying on a continuum. At one extreme is the deliberative model realized in the democratic family and the local cooperative community, where anything short of consensus is regarded as failure. The opposite pole is occupied by groups in which individuals simply arrive with their preferred views, announce them, count the votes, and resolve the question through some prearranged voting rule. The contemporary world contains a vast number of decision-making groups, sometimes cutting across national boundaries. In principle, all of these decision-making bodies could be mapped on the continuum I've imagined. Are they extremely deliberative, or are they extremely just sort of cast your votes and go home? Dewey's meliorist pragmatism, which I share, doesn't propose making all group decisions express the deep democracy of the ideal family or the ideal town meeting. That's surely a utopian dream. Instead, it suggests thinking of progress in democracy. Democracy is always a work in progress, as constituted by moving the practice of group decision-making towards the deliberative pole. Although the proposal, as I've stated, it covers more than political democracy, it's reasonable to think of its most important applications as within the political sphere. Thinking about families teaches us how deliberations can go awry in three major ways. The participants may be the wrong people. Some affected by the outcome may be left out. People not affected by the outcome may be brought in. Second, the discussion can proceed on the basis of faulty factual information. And third, discussants may not be committed to mutual understanding and to finding a solution with which everybody can live. All three symptoms are apparent in current American politics. Like Dewey a century ago, I view the failure of democracy in America as resulting in the frequency with which these pathologies are found. That diagnosis rests on comparing present political life with an ideal of democratic deliberation. An ideal democratic deliberation is fully representative, fully informed, and mutually engaged. Full representation requires that the perspective of each person who would be affected by the decision be represented, and that the perspectives of those unaffected not be represented. Full information requires that pertinent information bearing on the issue, findings confirmed through rigorous inquiry, be accepted by each discussant, and that no unsupported proposition be used in defending an opinion or proposal. Mutual engagement requires that each participant be committed to understanding the perspectives of each other discussant and to finding a solution that all who have engaged in the discussion are willing to accept. These are extremely strong conditions, probably impossible to realize even in the most democratic family, let alone in any aspect of political life. But utopia isn't my aim or Dewey's. Ideals are intended as diagnostic tools to help us see what's wrong with where we are and how we might improve the situation. Making progress depends on understanding what makes realizing the ideal so absurd a fantasy. For many political issues, it's impossible to assemble representatives of all the pertinent perspectives, attending to the fine-grained detail of each. There are too many points of view, and some of those who hold them are unable to speak for themselves. They are too young, too old, too afflicted, or simply not yet born. Representation must often be coarse, lumping together people who would insist on differentiating their views. Excluding the unaffected is in principle easier, although strictly speaking, that would be unnecessary if the condition requiring mutual engagement were perfectly satisfied. People whose interests were unaffected by the issue, but who were ideally mutually engaged, would simply excuse themselves and leave. The full representation condition recognizes the multi-scale character of democracy and assigns issues to particular political levels. The community, the state level, the national level. In particular, because some questions, like climate change, affect the human population as a whole, including future generations who must be represented, the condition points to the need for democratic deliberation on a transnational and transgenerational scale. Now, plainly, if falsehoods are accepted or truths are ignored, the most well-intentioned deliberation can easily produce unfortunate conclusions. Since people are not omniscient, it's unhelpful to evaluate the discussions we have by inquiring whether we're using all and only relevant truths. Improving political debate is a matter of trying to ensure that participants don't rely on unsupported conjectures and that they do come to terms with conclusions for which there is convincing evidence. Because people often disagree on what's speculation and what's firmly established, advancing the epistemic quality of deliberation isn't a trivial matter. It is, however, something to which education might contribute. As I've suggested, developing capacities for critical reasoning and understanding evidence would surely improve some of our urgent political discussions. Even more evidently, education might develop capacities enabling citizens to engage more fully with others. Indeed, its principal contribution to participation in civic life should lie not in the inculcation of the cognitive skills for bringing elective preferences closer to genuine interests, but rather in a greater understanding of the diversity of perspectives within our society and a deeper commitment to engaging with and learning from divergent views. At the end of this lecture, I'm going to have much more to say about how this might be achieved. Yet even when utopianism gives way to a more modest meliorism, you might still think of the deliberative ideal and of Deweyan solidarity as far too optimistic. For whatever realistic steps are taken towards making political discussions more representative, better informed, and more deeply mutually engaged, you may well doubt the ability of the reforms to generate consensus. To use a figure popular among the Stoics, the practical measures available in contemporary society are equivalent to raising a drowning man currently 10 feet beneath the water's surface by a foot or two. The achievable progress along the dimensions marked out by the ideal has no effect on the final outcomes of debates. At the end of the day, votes have to be taken, and the losers are bound to go away unsatisfied. So people like me who emphasize the role of deliberation in democracy are often accused of seeing the world through rose-tinted spectacles. We can reasonably retort by pointing to the dangers of failing to achieve a consensus. When some members of a society believe themselves to be outvoted again and again, they come to view their interests as systematically ignored and often campaign for separatism. Sometimes splintering does no harm, but dividing a large population into groups that no longer deliberate together can have costs. Democracy no longer exists at the scale where it's needed. To return to the example with which I began, one of the deepest problems posed by climate change centers on the need for institutions to govern global cooperation. When the trend is to pursue democracy more locally, the prospects for meeting that need diminish. Realism requires not only recognizing the difficulties of consensus, but also the costs of abandoning attempts to deliberate. Simple reliance on voting risks one of two pathological outcomes: the fracturing of democracies so that they no longer operate at the appropriate scale, or an oscillation of policymaking so that the actions introduced by one transient majority are reversed by its equally transient successor. Instead of viewing optimistic deliberativists as pitted against clear-eyed political realists, it would be better to recognize an important challenge. How can deliberation best work to maintain a cooperative democratic polity given the difficulties of consensus, especially in heterogeneous societies? The three conditions of the ideal of democratic deliberation, full representation, full information, and mutual engagement, indicate ways in which, even when an issue is ultimately resolved through voting, those who lose may be able to accept the decision. Living with policies you oppose is never easy. But to the extent you take your views to have been heard, to the extent you supposed correct and relevant information to have been considered, and the extent to which the discussants are recognized as genuinely concerned to find a solution tolerable by all, you may be moved to reflect on your own prior perspective. Humility has a place among the civic democratic virtues. When views have been heard by open-minded, well-informed listeners, the failure of those views to carry the day should provoke some reconsideration among those who hold them. The ideal of democratic deliberation also allows three mitigating conditions that make consensus more likely. First, the consensus at which it aims is modest. A deliberation would achieve strong consensus just in case it concluded with a position ranked by all the participants as the best option. Critics of deliberativist optimism are entirely right to charge that on many of the issues that arise for contemporary societies, strong consensus is highly improbable. The ideal, however, focuses on a different species of consensus. At the end of any discussion, each of the participants will have a collection of options deemed tolerable, the person's acceptable set. A deliberation reaches weak consensus just in case the conclusion finally adopted belongs to each discussant's acceptable set. Plainly, weak consensus is more likely than strong consensus. Its chances can be boosted if the engagement with others tends to expand the options considered tolerable. Although they come to the conversation with commitment to a narrow range of possibilities, the deliberators might find themselves including more options as outcomes with which they can live as they interact with one another, until ultimately the intersection of their acceptable sets is no longer empty. If the candidates in the final vote all belong to this intersection, weak consensus is achieved. The second mitigating condition elaborates the idea just sketched. Acceptable sets are most obviously expanded through compromise. Compromise is often seen as a patchwork in which elements from different perspectives are more or less clumsily stitched together. But the appropriate concept of compromise for ideal deliberation is shaped by the intended goal, the production of weak consensus. For an option to belong to a deliberator's acceptable set, it must respond to the central needs of the deliberator's perspective as that perspective has evolved throughout the discussion. Apt compromises would not combine elements of the positions with which the deliberators begin, but should respond to the changes of perspective produced by learning more about one's fellow citizens. Nor need these compromises be any kind of patchwork. The evolution of perspectives can allow for a reconceptualization of the issue and an emergent option that was previously invisible. The third mitigating condition builds on the thought of compromise by adding a historical dimension. Democratic deliberations aren't single events. They belong to a sequence of discussions. The past matters. In particular, when weak consensus repeatedly fails, with one group of citizens consistently being confronted with an outcome they deem unacceptable, subsequent deliberations can and should take account of the fact. Mutual engagement demands attending to perspectives whose central goals have previously been frustrated. Cross-temporal compromise would try to compensate for the past. Just as acceptable sets include the options with which deliberators can live, so acceptable records include sequences of decisions holders of different perspectives find tolerable. When democratic deliberations fail to achieve weak consensus, they may yet, in sequence, produce something weaker still, but still significant. A history of deliberations could be said to resist partition just in case the sequence of decisions generated belongs to the acceptable record of each perspective within the polity. So that's an ideal of democratic deliberation, and I've tried to respond to charges of wide-eyed optimism. But I haven't yet given an argument for the ideal. My defense will ground deep democracy in ethics. Ethical life, as I argued in a book some years ago, emerged in our species tens of thousands of years ago as our remote ancestors began what I call the ethical project. My version of ethical naturalism views ethics as grounded in features of the human predicament. Specifically, Homo sapiens has evolved to be a particular type of social species, one living in groups mixed by age and sex. That kind of group life requires a psychological capacity, responsiveness, I'll call it, enabling us to recognize, at least sometimes, the wishes, plans, and intentions of our fellows, and to respond, at least sometimes, in ways those fellows and we find acceptable and even helpful. That capacity, an evolved capacity present in our ancestors, made and makes it possible for us to live together. But human responsiveness is not so well adapted to our form of social life that we can live together smoothly and easily. Over a long period, at least 50,000 years, maybe as much as 100,000 years, our ancestors have improved the situation. They've expanded our responsiveness to others by introducing rules and patterns of behavior, a rich vocabulary for describing character, and a vast array of myths and stories, systems of blaming and praising. All of that constitutes ethical practice. That practice makes progress through overcoming the problems arising at a time. As with technology, efforts to solve one problem typically introduce derivative problems spun off from the original problem. In this case, the problem is the problem of our limited responsiveness, and it continues to emerge in new forms throughout subsequent generations. Despite all our successes in fostering greater responsiveness to others, new situations still arise in which human beings fail to recognize or to support the aspirations of their fellows. With all the ramifications and complexities of our ethical codes, the limitations of human responsiveness and the difficulties to which they give rise remain evident. There are cases of progress. Abolishing slavery was one of them. Recognizing the wrongness of those kinds of acts was one. Recognizing the possibilities for women to participate fully in public life was another. Recognizing that sex and love and romance are really about relationships between people and not matters of which organs get associated with one another. A wonderful revolution that's occurred within my own lifetime was a third progressive shift in our ethical thinking. In all cases, greater responsiveness to other people. So, how do you get a method for addressing this kind of problem, the problem of limited responsiveness? Well, I'm going to offer a thesis. Revision of ethical practice should be prompted by the problems of the times and should be undertaken by having representatives of the perspectives of all those affected by the problem deliberate together under the best available approximation to the ideal of democratic deliberation. That, if you think about it, is the obvious way to overcome limitations of responsiveness. Let the people speak to one another directly and engage with one another. When politics is more than the efficient administration of an unproblematic ethical code, it's a matter of reshaping, refining, reforming ethical practice and applying the resultant framework to cope with the problem at hand. Deep democracy, committed to the ideal of democratic deliberation and thus to mutual education and to solidarity, attempts to realize ethical practice in political life. It demands mutual enlightenment and attempts at mutual sympathy. In this sense, democracy is education. Well, education, you might think, has disappeared. My main efforts have been directed at finding an appropriate way to think about democracy, one that might be deployed to identify the shortcomings of our current situation and to indicate some ways of overcoming them. If million democracy offered an adequate ideal, the project of envisaging educational reform could have extended the discussion with which I started earlier, concentrated on explaining in more detail how to prepare citizens to recognize their interests when many of the issues they confront are technical and when public pronouncements about them are misleading. But million democracy misses a dimension. An essential task of education today is to help restore the possibilities of community democracy requires. How? So as with the last lecture, I'm going to end with some proposals for experiments. As I said last time, I don't think we have a basis for knowing what to do. We have to try things out and see how they work. Some of these are inspired by practices already tried out in schools, particularly progressive schools like Summerhill and Dewey's Chicago Lab School, as it was originally founded. The proposals I'll offer could be elaborated in any number of different ways. I don't know, and I don't know whether anyone knows how to specify the details. The hope is that some program along the lines I'm going to suggest might educate citizens for deep democracy. The intended result is to produce people who are eager to engage with and learn from others, even with those from whose perspectives they initially find alien. A very direct way to attempt that would be to use the ideal of democratic deliberation throughout the sequence of formal educational stages. At the very beginning, a small group of children might be asked to decide which game they would next like to play. The adult or adults present makes it clear that the children are to reach agreement if they can. The adult role is to facilitate the conversation, to make sure that each child has the chance to speak, that no child dominates, that everyone knows what the various options require, perhaps to introduce possibilities of compromise. You know, you could do this for half the time and that for the other half. The discussion only stops when each member of the group is willing to go ahead with the plan. So get them started on it very early, at age 3. Assuming that early efforts along these lines produce propensities to include everyone's views, to seek out pertinent facts, and to be unsatisfied until weak consensus had been reached, adult participation should gradually diminish. The initial propensities would be further developed by tackling harder problems of the same kind, cases involving a greater diversity of perspectives, perhaps demanding more significant sacrifices of some individuals. In line with the recognition of historical patterns in decision-making, the same group might address a sequence of problems so that its members would acquire a disposition to compensate those who had previously been disappointed. And then you go further. You try to extend these propensities by arranging for joint decision-making with previously unknown children. Is it possible to transfer a talent for iterated deliberation to the one-shot case? Maybe. The aim of the first stages of the program would be to cultivate a sense of satisfaction with the activity itself, planning with others would come to appear, one hopes, enjoyable, rewarding, perhaps especially so when the radically divergent perspectives expressed at the beginning evolve into acceptance of a common solution. The next stages of my program suggest how an attempt to embody the ideal of democratic deliberation might be combined with more standard aspects of school education. I envisage geography, anthropology, and history as showing their importance in extensive understandings of the relations among groups of people. Examples from the contemporary world and from the past can reveal very clearly the high points of mutual engagement and cooperation and the sufferings produced when joint deliberation either breaks down or more commonly is never undertaken in the first place. We should study the cases of oppression and subjugation and dominance and teach our children what the impact of those events has been. Further, following a hint from Mill's inaugural address, it would be valuable to integrate the early discussions with children from different backgrounds with the learning of a second language. Mill's case for studying the classical languages began from the thought that deep access to a culture requires acquiring the language native to its adherents. Whether or not that's exactly right, any program aimed at fostering engagement across cultures would be aided by promoting the ability to learn foreign languages. Studies indicate that the beginning early, even at 3 years of age, facilitates not only fluency in the second language, but also greater ease in acquiring further languages. So I propose a double experiment. First, combine exercises in joint planning with instructions in some language used by children with whom those taught will have repeated opportunities to plan. Thus, in areas of the country with a large Hispanic population, introduce Spanish beginning at age 3. Second, pursue longitudinal studies to test whether the long-term effects in ability to acquire new languages are greater or less when the first foreign language learned is unrelated to the native language, e.g. when English speakers begin with Arabic or Chinese rather than Spanish. In these studies, too, language learning should be combined with opportunities for joint planning. The last two phases of my program are directed towards immersing people in cultures other than their own, with the goals of fostering respect for differences and of developing capacities for engagement under what initially seem the most taxing conditions. If adolescents and young adults spend a significant period of time working alongside people whose backgrounds differ greatly from their own, and if every decade or so that experience is repeated with new groups of strangers, two important consequences may flow. First, for the problems demanding democracy on a global scale, transnational deliberation may go more smoothly. Second, the returning citizens might bring fresh eyes and new perspectives to their own internal debates. So you'll see in what I've said two main themes of my lectures. First, education today can only be a lifelong matter. There's far too much that we need to know and to be able to do. Second, democracy is needed at many scales, from the local context at which it comes relatively easily to the global cooperation where the challenges are severe. As the example with which I began, the case of climate change reminds us, failure to meet the challenge of crafting international democracy will bequeath to our descendants, to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a world in which even the most sublime discussions, not mine, of education, democracy, and the good life will seem a cruel joke. They will be a biting reminder of the privileges of a bygone age. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. At this point, it's your turn. If there are questions, comments, observations.
First off, I want to say thank you, Phil, for a very stimulating lecture today. You started by talking about global climate change, and I want to talk about those sorts of big issues. So obviously, with global climate change, the only policies that'll really make a significant impact on global climate temperature would be national level policies. But in America, generally the citizenry does not vote on the Kyoto Treaty, does not vote on the Paris Accords, does not actually vote on any legislation at all. Congress votes on specific technical legislation. And moreover, often we don't think of our congressmen as representing our own interests. Often voters elect congressmen who are seen as delegates. People say, I like the character of this particular person. I feel that this person is a good leader. Therefore, I will entrust this person with the vote in Congress, assuming that they will do the right thing better than me.
This is the so-called pork rinds effect, I think. You know, he eats pork rinds, my kind of guy.
Exactly. And I'm not 100% convinced that that is bad or wrong, although I could probably be convinced. So what that leaves us with is situations where, on the one hand, the populace might be very poorly informed about a particular technical issue, say, for example, the federal budget. But even though, in general, the citizenry does not have a lot of technical expertise, in general, those issues tend to be dealt with competently. Nobody really is, on either side of the aisle, is totally satisfied with the way the budget is balanced, let's say. But in America, we haven't really seen the sort of hyperinflation or economic collapse that has doomed other societies. On the other hand, there's often instances where there's broad agreement on both sides of the political spectrum among the citizenry, say for things like criminal justice reform. But nonetheless, there's inaction in Congress because of various forces, whether they be multinational corporations and their lobbyists, whether it's fears about political optics. I mean, there's all sorts of things. So my question is, in an indirect democracy like America, to what extent and how, I guess, would your robust education proposals make an impact on the sorts of technical policy decisions that really only come about through national legislation?
Okay, it's a very good question. The first thing I want to say is that nothing I've said about the educational approach is intended to apply to the climate change problem. We simply don't have enough time to do the educational experiments, work out a better educational system, and then sometime in the future have a group of citizens who are so campaigning for the United States to get back into the Paris Accords, et cetera, that some process of mitigating disaster will go ahead. So that I want to be completely clear about that. So I've tried to approach that differently in a recent book that I wrote with Evelyn Fox Keller, which is called The Seasons Alter, How to Save Our Planet in 6 Acts. And it breaks the climate change problem down into 6 pieces, 6 questions that have to be, and it offers dialogues as models for conversations between climate deniers and climate activists, in the hope of, and now I'm coming directly to your question, that what you get out of this kind of democratic conversation is a grassroots movement to which the delegates and representatives are forced to listen. Now, one of the depressing things about our politics at the moment is that it's very, very clear that the party in power is not listening to the will of the majority. I mean, that with respect both to the Affordable Care Act and with respect to this tax reform bill, what you got actually is something that's extremely unpopular with the majority of people. So plainly there's a disconnect there. But the thought behind this is a very Tocquevillian thought, is that if you can get solidarity at local levels and snowballing movements, then that puts pressure on those who go to Washington. And I mean, I think that I think the possibilities for deep democracy, as it were, in throwing the rascals out, are actually quite, are quite good. So if you actually get a condition, then that's the way it would work. That's what I'm suggesting. But for the climate change problem, you can't do that through education.
You mentioned 2 schools.
It's okay.
Excuse me, you need the microphone.
You mentioned the lab school in Summerhill.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you could describe the future of graduates from those schools. What did that schooling experience do to individuals that graduated from those schools?
Well, according to the headmaster, to Neil, who was the headmaster of Somerville, what he was proudest of was that although his students went on to many walks of life, he was proudest of the fact that they were happy and cooperative citizens and members of a community. The trouble with the lab school example is I don't know the data on the people who graduated from it at the time when it was being run by Jane Addams and John Dewey. Luckily for Columbia, my own home university, Dewey got into a fight with the president of the University of Chicago, because he wanted his wife to take over as head of the lab school. And when the president denied this request, he left and went off. And the character of the lab school has changed after that. I don't know whether there are any graduates from the lab school here. I mean, it's just become an extremely fine, it still preserves some of the experimental features that Dewey had for it, but it doesn't have the same sort of, as I understand it, the same social emphasis that it had at the beginning. Summerhill really did go in for joint deliberation and decision making all the way, with the staff being on a par with the pupils. And Neil was, as I said, very proud of the fact that he thought that he had people who went on to very, prestigious jobs. He had people who went on to very sort of low-level jobs. But he says the overall fact is that they all lived happy and rewarding lives, and they were good, as it were, members of a community, good citizens.
Thank you for your talk. First, I want to say that in studying recognition theory, I would say that recognition theory also comes to very similar conclusions to what you laid out in your presentation. So I find that interesting. And my question is, I agree with pretty much everything you said. And I think that in some ways we could go farther, but there's a question of how to enforce that that step. So my question is, how can we encourage democratic deliberation at the most formative level, which is the family unit, if those families do not want to teach their children these values, or if the family is not even stable enough to foster those kind of values or atmosphere? Because at the family level, you have a difference in what you can enforce than at the level of the schools. And I guess I'm concerned if the schools are enough to teach democratic deliberation.
It's a very good question. I'm going to answer it by building on what I said last time. So last time I envisaged a process starting very early, when children are about 6 months old, in which they spend time in a very well-equipped care center in which the parents participate. And I actually envisage interactions and mutual learning about parenting among the parents from their exposure in that. So obviously, the government is not and should not go into the family home and sort of start disciplining and fining and ticketing and all that sort of thing, people who don't abide by the democratic idea. It should rather make that ideal so vivid and so attractive, both to the children who are in their early preschool years and to the adults who participate in that. See the adults coming. So I'm full of concern for so many parents in our society today who struggle terribly with the most basic things. And I think of their involvement in these preschools and in the schools as for them a system of support through which they can be helped and they can develop their own talents as parents. So I think of it not only as an educational experience for the little ones, but also as the evolution of parenting through mutual interaction in this context. So that's really how I'd answer that. So recognition theory, very interesting. So are you thinking of critical theory and Axel Honneth and people? Okay, so Axel Honneth is my part-time colleague, and we discovered some years ago from a graduate student who was taking both our seminars about the kinship between our ideas. We talk a lot.
That was a great answer, by the way. So Dewey talked about conjoint, communicated, what's the third word?
Experience?
Yeah, that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
And you talk about deep democracy. And it all seems like you're talking about helping people develop a sense of a common good, but you don't use that word ever. And I'm just curious.
Well, that's because, the reason I do that is because I've got a theory of the good. So the ethical view I developed in the ethical project tries to understand what the common good is in terms of what would emerge from as it were, an ideal discussion. So what I'm saying, talk about the common good is dead cheap. But when you start when people start asking what is the common good, then it gets really tricky. People disagree about what it is. And so you need, at this point, some sort of philosophical backdrop to it. And that's what that very quick run through my approach to ethics was meant to supply for you. It was an account of the common good in deliberative terms. Okay?
I admire your wealth of ideas and the beauty of the organization.
Well, thank you. That's a nice thing to say.
All right. Democracy is not an artificial product. It's a product of history. That is, the democracy you are talking about is not constructed by anyone artificially. Of course, human beings construct things, but in a deeper sense, there are historical conditions that were necessary. Now, we know that there are non-democratic traditions in the world still, and they are vying with one another, and in fact, there are many conflicts there. So I wonder if your somewhat utopian commitment to democracy and education carries the following hypothesis, namely that democracy is the entelechy of the historical process. You may have that, but you are reluctant to express it. I wonder that is the case. And a related question is this: are you addressing those who have affinity with you and democracy, or are you addressing the global intellectual community? If the latter is the case, I think it may be necessary for you to spend more time on philosophical anthropology, ethics, ontology, etc.
Okay, so how to answer that? I don't think that democracy is the expression of some essence in a progressive historical movement. I'm not a Hegelian. I'm not any kind of teleological thinker. And I'm not a utopian. My view is that the task of philosophy is to try to understand the current situation in various respects so as to facilitate a form of progress which is not teleological, but is the overcoming of the problems and deficiencies of the present. So that's where I start from. I want to think of what I'm saying as very situated in a particular place at a particular time. It may be relevant to other places and other times, but I'm starting with democracy, or so-called democracy, as it exists in the United States in the early 21st century. And I'm trying to articulate an account of, or give some diagnostic tools, and to give an account of, as I said to the last question, of the common good, which will enable us, or would enable us if it were taken up and translated into action, to make progress from where we are now. That's the goal. And I'm, like Dewey, I'm mainly interested in doing philosophy in that mode, not dealing with abstract questions of ontology, but dealing with questions of ethics. And I do, of course, have behind this my own ethical account on which I'm relying. And it's quite possible that other people will find that defective and will see it as the Achilles heel of my program. But that's the way it goes. Now, if you want me to export this to some other place, I will willingly let other people use these ideas to the extent they find them interesting. But for the moment, I'm really concentrating on the countries I know best, and the one I know best is my adopted country, the United States. The one I know second best is well, probably at this stage, the one I know second best is Germany, but is my former native land. And those are the sorts of countries where I think some of these ideas might have some traction. Some of my ideas apparently are of interest to people in China, and that strikes me as an authoritarian regime, and that pleases me, but it's not something that I expect. So I'm not, as it were, trying to do the traditional philosophical thing of saying, what is the just society? What is the ideal system of education? What I'm trying to do is to take a particular situation and improve it. I think philosophy has the great philosophers, I'm going to say something about the character of philosophy. I think the great philosophers of the past have been great synthesizers who have brought together positions that have enabled people to understand their lives and their predicaments more clearly. And they wrongly thought that these were timeless. I think it's that philosophy is always historically situated, and that you always, as it were, construct a good picture for a time for the purposes of trying to improve the situation that you're in at that moment in time. So it's in some ways a more modest vision than I think you're appreciating. But I don't know whether I mean, it's a very deep and complex question that you asked me, and I probably didn't come to terms with all of it.
Well, I know that there are other questions out there, but we have promised our speaker a dinner this evening, and it's possible that some of you may have plans too. At the very least, you will have something to think about and talk about over your meal, and for that, please join me in thanking Philip Kitcher.
Well, thank you again.